You burn the cabin, you shoot the horses, and you bring me Cole's head. As for the woman, leave her on the mountain. Let the elements finish what she started.
The church bells hadn't even stopped ringing when the first gunshot shattered the valley's peace. They said Gideon Cole, the fiercest trapper in the Bitterroots, started a war over a woman. But he didn't just choose a bride that day. He chose a bloodbath. And this is the true story. The town of Silver Bow, Montana, in the late spring of 1887, was a powder keg of greed and new money. Built on the backs of miners and cattlemen, it was a place where fortunes were won in a day and lost by a single bullet. Above it all, casting a long, jagged shadow over the sprawling cattle ranches of the valley, loomed the Bitterroot Mountains. And in those mountains lived Gideon Cole. Gideon was not a man built for polite society. Standing 6'4" with shoulders like a pack mule and eyes the color of a winter storm, he was a mountain man in the truest sense. He had spent the last 12 years carving out a life in the brutal high country, surviving grizzly attacks, avalanches, and winters so cold they could snap a pine tree in half. But Gideon possessed something far more valuable than the furs he trapped or the gold flakes he occasionally panned from the river. He owned the deed to the Deep Creek Basin. In a land where summer droughts turned the valley floor to cracked glass, the Deep Creek Basin was the only guaranteed year-round water source. It was a lush, hidden paradise of glacial runoff and deep lakes, and it stood directly above the massive Montgomery cattle empire. Harrison Montgomery, the patriarch of the empire, was a man who believed the world existed solely to be bought or broken by him. He owned the town's bank, the saloon, the sheriff, and nearly every acre of flat land in the county, but he didn't own the water. For years, Harrison had tried to buy Gideon out, offering exorbitant sums of gold, prime real estate in San Francisco, and even a seat on the bank's board. Gideon had refused every time, usually without speaking a single word, simply turning his massive back and walking back into the pines. Realizing that money could not buy the mountain man, Harrison Montgomery changed his tactics. He decided to use the oldest snare in human history, his daughter, Clara. Clara Montgomery was the undisputed jewel of Silver Bow. Educated in Boston, she possessed a porcelain beauty, sharp wit, and an ambition that rivaled her father's. She was accustomed to men falling at her feet, destroying themselves for a mere glance from her emerald eyes. The plan was simple, ruthless, and entirely understood by everyone in the Montgomery household. Clara would seduce the mountain man, marry him, and through the union, the Montgomery family would legally absorb the Deep Creek Basin. For months, the trap was laid. Whenever Gideon descended into Silver Bow for supplies, Clara was there. She orchestrated accidental meetings at the general store, invited him to lavish Sunday dinners at the Montgomery estate, and played the part of a fascinated, demure woman captivated by his wild nature. Gideon, a man of few words and profound isolation, seemed to fall for it. He attended the dinners. He sat awkwardly in their velvet chairs, his large, calloused hands resting on his knees, listening to Clara play the piano. The entire town whispered that the marriage was a done deal. The wild beast was being tamed, and the Montgomerys were about to monopolize the entire territory. But Harrison and Clara, in their arrogance, failed to notice where Gideon's eyes wandered when he wasn't sitting in their parlor. Far removed from the opulence of the Montgomery estate, on a barren, rocky plot of land on the edge of the foothills, lived Maeve O'Connor. Maeve was not a jewel. She was a survivor, an Irish immigrant who had lost her husband to fever on the Oregon Trail 3 years prior. She had staked a desperate claim on a piece of land nobody else wanted. She was small, fiercely independent, and bore a pale scar across her cheek from a farming accident. She spent her days breaking unyielding soil, chopping her own wood, and shooting coyotes that came for her meager flock of chickens. Maeve's hands were not soft, and she possessed none of Clara's polished grace. Her dresses were faded calico, perpetually stained with dirt and sweat. Yet, there was a fire in her spirit that burned brighter than any hearth. Gideon had first noticed Maeve 2 winters ago. A freak blizzard had swept through the valley, dropping 3 feet of snow in a matter of hours. Gideon, navigating the foothills on snowshoes, had seen the smoke from her chimney sputtering and dying. He found her half frozen in her barn, desperately trying to keep her last cow alive with her own body heat. He hadn't asked permission. He had simply built a roaring fire, hauled in enough wood to last a month, and left a slaughtered elk on her porch. Since that day, an unspoken, profound bond had formed between the rugged mountain man and the resilient widow. It was not a courtship of parlor games and piano music. It was built in the quiet moments of shared survival. Gideon would leave prime cuts of meat at her property line. Maeve would leave freshly baked bread and mended wool socks on a specific flat rock near the creek. When the spring thaws came, Gideon would secretly divert small streams to irrigate her failing crops. They rarely spoke more than a handful of words to each other, but the silence between them was not empty. It was heavy, with a mutual understanding of hardship, resilience, and a quiet, burning respect. Gideon saw in Maeve the same untamed spirit that lived within the Bitterroots. She did not want to change him, own him, or use him. She simply saw him. And in return, Gideon, a man who had isolated himself from the world, found himself yearning for the light in her tired eyes. As the summer of 1887 approached, the tension in Silver Bow reached a boiling point. The Montgomerys were eager to finalize the trap. Harrison formally announced the Grand Silver Bow Spring Cotillion, a massive, opulent dance held at the newly constructed town hall. It was universally understood by the political elite and the common townsfolk alike that this would be the night Gideon Cole would formally propose to Clara Montgomery. Clara had already commissioned a wedding dress from New York. Harrison had already drafted the legal documents to merge the Deep Creek Basin water rights into his portfolio. They had accounted for every variable, every social pressure, and every element of human greed. They had accounted for everything except a mountain man's heart. The night of the Silver Bow Spring Cotillion was unseasonably warm. The town hall was draped in expensive silk bunting, illuminated by hundreds of imported crystal lanterns that cast a golden, shimmering glow over the valley's elite. Carriages lined the muddy streets, and the sound of a full-string band drifted out into the mountain air. Inside, the room was a sea of expensive broadcloth suits and rustling silk gowns. Clara Montgomery stood at the center of it all, radiating an icy, triumphant beauty in a dress of deep emerald velvet that matched her eyes. Her father, Harrison, stood near the punch bowl, casually smoking a cigar with the town's judge and the local sheriff, Wyatt Hayes. They were all waiting. When the heavy oak doors of the hall pushed open, the music faltered, and a hush fell over the crowd. Gideon Cole stood in the doorway. He had shed his usual buckskins and bear-hide coat. In their place, he wore a dark, tailored suit that fit his massive frame perfectly, though he still looked entirely out of place, like a wolf forced into a dog collar. He did not check his Colt revolver at the door, and no one, not even the sheriff, was foolish enough to ask him to. Clara's lips curled into a victorious smile. She stepped forward, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. She extended her delicate, gloved hand, expecting Gideon to take it, to lead her to the center of the floor, and to give her the ring her father had practically demanded. "You clean up remarkably well, Mr. Cole," Clara said, her voice carrying through the silent hall, dripping with honeyed expectation. "We were beginning to wonder if the mountain had kept you." Gideon looked at her. His stormy eyes betrayed no emotion. He did not take her hand. He didn't even stop walking. To the absolute shock of the entire room, Gideon stepped precisely around Clara Montgomery, as if she were nothing more than a fallen branch in his path. The smile froze on Clara's face. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Harrison Montgomery's cigar dropped from his fingers, landing on the polished wooden floor in a shower of sparks. Gideon's heavy boots echoed loudly against the floorboards as he walked with terrifying purpose past the wealthy ranchers, past the gaping politicians, and toward the back of the hall. There, near the kitchen doors, trying her best to remain unseen, stood Maeve O'Connor. She was not a guest. She had been hired for the evening to help wash the endless stacks of crystal glasses and plates. She wore a simple, faded brown cotton dress, an apron tied around her waist, and her hair was pulled back into a severe bun. She looked exhausted, her hands red and raw from the lye soap. When she saw Gideon walking toward her, her breath hitched. She instinctively took a step back, her eyes darting nervously toward the furious faces of the Montgomerys. Gideon stopped inches from her. The immense, intimidating presence of the mountain man suddenly softened. He reached out with a hand scarred from hunting and rough weather, and gently, with a reverence that made the room ache with tension, he reached up and untied the knot of her apron. He pulled it over her head and let it drop to the floor. "Gideon," Maeve whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing? You shouldn't." "I told you I'd come down the mountain when it was time," Gideon said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried across the silent room. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a ring. It wasn't diamond or gold. It was a band carved from pure, polished elk antler, inlaid with a single, flawless vein of mountain turquoise he had mined himself. He took her raw, soap-stained hand in his. "I don't want the valley," Gideon said, looking only at her. "I just want you. Will you ride up the trail with me, Maeve?" Tears instantly spilled over Maeve's scarred cheek. She didn't look at the Montgomerys. She didn't care about the gasping, horrified crowd. She looked into the eyes of the man who had saved her life, the man who saw her as a queen in a faded dress. "Yes," she choked out. "Yes, Gideon. You're choosing her?" The voice was a high, shrill screech of disbelief and rage. Clara Montgomery had spun around, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She pointed a trembling, gloved finger at Maeve. "You are humiliating me in front of this entire town for a dirt-poor, scarred washerwoman? A beggar?" Before Gideon could speak, the explosive sound of a heavy boot stomping forward broke the tension. Emmett Montgomery, Clara's older brother, a man known for his violent temper and quick trigger finger, shoved his way through the crowd. His face was purple with rage. "You miserable mountain trash," Emmett roared, his hand dropping to the holster at his hip. "You don't disrespect my sister. You don't insult my family." Emmett drew his weapon, the silver barrel glinting in the lantern light. Women screamed. Men dove for cover behind the heavy oak tables. But Gideon moved with a speed that defied his massive size. Before Emmett could level the pistol, Gideon closed the distance. His left hand clamped down on the cylinder of Emmett's gun, preventing it from turning and firing. With a brutal, sickening crack that echoed over the screams, Gideon twisted Emmett's wrist backward, breaking it instantly. Emmett shrieked in agony, dropping the gun to the floor. Gideon didn't stop. He drove his right fist into Emmett's chest, sending the younger Montgomery flying backward into the punch bowl, shattering the crystal, and sending a wave of red liquid over the floorboards. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Sheriff Hayes drew his weapon, but he froze, his gun trembling as he looked into Gideon's eyes. The mountain man stood over Emmett, his hand now resting casually on the handle of his own Colt, radiating an aura of lethal intent that made the blood run cold in every man present. "Anyone else?" Gideon asked. The room was dead silent, save for Emmett's groans of pain. Garrison Montgomery stepped forward, his face a mask of cold, calculated fury. He didn't look at his son bleeding on the floor. He looked at Gideon, and then at Maeve. "You have made a grave mistake, Cole," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You think you can insult my blood and walk back up that mountain? You think you get to keep that water now? I will burn your timber to ash. I will slaughter your game. I will salt the earth of that miserable widow's farm, and you will drown in your own blood before I let you live in peace." Gideon didn't flinch. He walked back to Maeve, wrapping a protective arm around her waist. "Send your men, Harrison," Gideon replied, his voice echoing with the absolute certainty of a predator. "But tell them to bring their coffins, because the mountain doesn't forgive, and neither do I." With that, Gideon turned his back on the wealthiest men in the territory. He led Maeve out of the town hall, leaving behind a ruined dress, a broken man, and a shattered pride. They mounted Gideon's massive black draft horse, and rode out of Silverbow into the dark, ascending the winding trails back toward the Deep Creek Basin. They rode in silence, the cool mountain air washing over them. Maeve leaned her head against Gideon's broad chest, clutching the turquoise ring on her finger. She felt safe in his arms, but as she looked back down at the twinkling lights of Silverbow far below, a cold knot formed in her stomach. She knew Harrison Montgomery. She knew the power of his money and the depth of his wrath. Gideon hadn't just rejected a bride tonight, he had humiliated an empire. The battle lines were drawn not with ink on a contract, but with blood and broken bone. As the first light of dawn began to paint the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots in hues of violent orange and red, Maeve realized the terrifying truth. The mountain man had made his choice, but the war for their survival had only just begun. The ride up to Deep Creek Basin took 3 punishing hours, the trail winding through stands of ancient, towering ponderosa pines and over jagged granite ridges. When they finally broke through the tree line, the sun was fully cresting the peaks, bathing Gideon's secluded valley in a wash of pale morning gold. His cabin was a fortress of notched timber and riverstone built into the side of a cliff that offered only one narrow avenue of approach. It was a place designed for a man who expected the world to eventually come for him. As Gideon lifted Maeve down from the saddle, the sheer exhaustion of the night finally hit her. She swayed, her raw hands clutching the lapels of his borrowed suit coat. Gideon caught her effortlessly, carrying her across the threshold and setting her gently into a heavy, bearskin-draped chair near the hearth. "You're safe here," he murmured, kneeling to strike a match to the kindling in the fireplace. "Nobody knows this basin like I do, not even the wolves." Maeve looked around the Spartan but meticulously kept cabin. Rifles lined the walls, alongside snowshoes, cured pelts, and heavy iron traps. It was the lair of a solitary predator. Yet, looking at the man kneeling before the fire, she felt no fear. "Harrison won't let this go, Gideon," she whispered, her voice tight with reality. "He can't. His pride won't survive it, and neither will Clara's. They will bring an army." Gideon stood, his silhouette blocking the rising sun from the window. "I know," he said calmly. He unbuttoned his suit vest, discarding the garments of civilized society, and pulled on his heavy leather work shirt. He began loading a Winchester repeater, the metallic clack-clack of the lever action echoing off the log walls. "That's why we aren't going to wait for them to knock." Down in the valley, the Montgomery estate was a hive of furious, humiliated energy. Harrison Montgomery had not slept. He had immediately wired a telegram to Cheyenne, summoning a man named Josiah Flint, a notorious range detective and hired gun known for breaking strikes and clearing out stubborn homesteaders. By Tuesday afternoon, Flint arrived in Silverbow with 15 hardened regulators, men who cared nothing for the law and everything for Montgomery's gold. Clara had locked herself in her quarters, refusing to be seen by the town that was now whispering behind her back. Emmett, his arm heavily splinted and bound in a sling, fueled the men with whiskey and rage, demanding to ride out with them despite his injury. "You burn the cabin, you shoot the horses, and you bring me Cole's head," Harrison instructed Flint in the dusty courtyard of the estate. "As for the woman, leave her on the mountain. Let the elements finish what she started." At dawn on Wednesday, Flint's posse began their ascent. They were heavily armed, riding expensive quarter horses, and arrogant in their numbers. But the Bitterroots were not the open plains, and they were stepping into a world where Gideon Cole was the undisputed master. The first sign of trouble occurred 2 miles below the basin. A narrow gorge known as Devil's Throat was the only passage large enough for horses. As the regulators rode through in single file, the deafening crack of a rifle shot echoed from the high cliffs. The lead horse reared, struck not by a bullet, but panicked by a massive pine tree that suddenly crashed across the trail, severed by a perfectly placed stick of mining dynamite Gideon had rigged the night before. Before the regulators could draw their weapons, a second explosion rocked the gorge behind them. A rock slide tumbled down, sealing off their retreat. "Dismount!" Josiah Flint roared, pulling his repeater from its scabbard. "He's up in the rocks! Fan out!" But Gideon wasn't in the rocks. He was a phantom. Moving with the silent, deadly grace of a cougar, he hunted the hunters. He didn't aim to kill, not at first. He aimed to maim, to terrify, to dismantle their confidence. A bullet shattered the stock of a regulator's rifle. Another shot clipped the heel off a man's boot, sending him tumbling down a steep ravine with a broken leg. For hours, the posse was pinned down in the freezing mud of the gorge, shooting blindly at shadows and rustling branches. The mountain itself seemed to be rejecting them. Back at the cabin, Maeve was not sitting idly by the fire. She had lived through the Oregon Trail, buried a husband, and carved a farm out of bedrock. She found a spare double-barreled shotgun, loaded it with heavy buckshot, and fortified the windows. She boiled water, tore linen for bandages, and waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was not a damsel waiting to be rescued. She was a pioneer woman defending her home. By late afternoon, desperation drove Josiah Flint to a reckless decision. Leaving his wounded men behind, he forced the remaining 7 regulators, including a fiercely determined Emmett Montgomery, to scale the steep, treacherous eastern ridge on foot. It was a brutal, grueling climb that tore their hands and exhausted their lungs, but it bypassed the blocked gorge and brought them directly above Gideon's cabin. "There," Emmett spat, panting heavily as he pointed down at the smoking chimney. "Burn it out. Burn them both," Flint signaled his men. They began a sliding, scrambling descent down the scree slope, preparing to rain fire on the timber roof. Gideon, returning from his harassment in the gorge, saw the movement on the ridge. He realized instantly that he was too far down the trail to intercept them before they reached the cabin. For the first time, a spike of genuine terror pierced his chest. Maeve was inside. He dropped his heavy pack and broke into a dead sprint up the mountain, his massive legs pumping, tearing through the underbrush, ignoring the tearing thorns and the burning in his lungs. At the cabin, Maeve heard the rattle of loose rocks outside. She peered through the heavy shutters and saw men rushing the porch, torches already lit. The window glass shattered inward as a heavy rock was hurled through. Maeve didn't scream. She leveled the shotgun at the broken window. As a regulator stepped onto the porch, raising a torch toward the dry eaves, she pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the 1-2 gauge filled the small room. The regulator was thrown backward off the porch, his shoulder shredded by buckshot. The others scrambled for cover, diving behind the woodpile in the water trough, shouting in shock. They hadn't expected the widow to shoot back. "Covering fire," Flint yelled, opening up with his Winchester. Bullets chewed through the cabin's thick door and shattered the remaining windows. Maeve dropped to the floor, crawling toward the back wall as splinters rained down around her. Emmett, seeing his chance, grabbed a fallen torch and rushed the side of the cabin, pressing himself against the logs where Maeve couldn't see him from the window. He threw the flaming pitch onto the roof. The dry pine needles caught instantly, flames licking eagerly at the timber. Suddenly, a blood-curdling roar echoed through the clearing. Gideon erupted from the tree line like a force of nature. He didn't bother raising his rifle. He hit the first regulator at a full sprint, tackling the man to the ground with bone-crushing force. He drew his heavy Bowie knife and the butt of his revolver, fighting with a savage, terrifying brutality that civilized men could not comprehend. He was the mountain incarnate wild, relentless, and defending his mate. Josiah Flint tried to draw a bead on him, but Gideon moved too fast, weaving through the chaos. Gideon fired his Colt, taking Flint in the thigh, dropping the hired gun to the dirt. Seeing their leader fall and witnessing the absolute fury of the mountain man, the remaining regulators broke. They dropped their weapons and scrambled back up the ridge, fleeing for their lives. Emmett Montgomery, however, did not run. Blinded by hatred and the throbbing pain in his splinted arm, he drew his revolver with his left hand and aimed it squarely at Gideon's back as the mountain man turned to stamp out the fire on the porch. "Gideon!" Maeve screamed, throwing open the cabin door. Gideon spun, but he was caught in the open. Emmett pulled the trigger. Click. The revolver jammed, fouled by the dirt from his climb. It was a singular second of divine intervention. Before Emmett could cock the hammer again, Gideon closed the distance. He didn't strike the boy. He simply ripped the gun from Emmett's hand and hoisted the cattle baron's son by the lapels of his ruined jacket, lifting him entirely off the ground. Emmett kicked and thrashed, but he was helpless in Gideon's grip. Gideon stared into Emmett's terrified eyes, his own eyes dark and stormy. "Tell your father," Gideon growled, his voice vibrating with lethal promise, "that the Deep Creek Basin is closed. If another Montgomery sets foot on this rock, I won't send them back alive." He tossed Emmett to the dirt like a broken toy. Emmett scrambled to his feet and ran, abandoning his hired men and his pride, disappearing into the timber. The siege was over. Gideon turned back to the cabin. The fire on the roof was small, and he quickly doused it with a bucket from the trough. He walked through the open door and found Maeve standing amidst the shattered glass and bullet-pocked wood, the shotgun still clutched in her hands, her face covered in soot. He gently took the gun from her trembling fingers and set it aside. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her hair. She wrapped her arms around his massive waist, burying her face in his leather shirt.